Hello, and welcome to the Family Histories podcast, a show for and about those of us who are sat quietly in libraries, archives, and spare rooms all around the world, tirelessly piecing together our collective social and family history. My name is Andrew Martin, I'm a family historian, and I'll be your host. In this episode, The Twin, we'll be hearing about a woman whose twinness extends to her siblings, with familiar traits echoing throughout the generations. And then we'll be looking for the origins of a 19th century shopkeeper who might have roots in Berlin, Germany. So, put down that old workhouse register, grab a cuppa, and let's meet our guest. My guest today is a professional family historian. She is the chair of the Register of Qualified Genealogists and a member of the Association of Scottish Genealogists and Researchers in Archives. Her PhD examined the opposition to smallpox vaccination in 19th and early 20th century Scotland, and she has a Master of Letters degree in family and local history. So, before I also get letters from listeners complaining about my waffling, I think it's time to meet my guest. It's Sylvia Valentine. Hello, Sylvia. Welcome to the Family Histories podcast.
Hello, Andrew, and thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. I'm excited to have you here. Now, we usually start with the same question, and that's, how did you get hooked on researching your family history?
Well, it's actually two things, really. Fairly early on in my marriage, I had a daughter, and I was chatting with my mother-in-law, who had a very unusual Christian name, and she was very curious about this Christian name.
Okay.
And I think my first challenge was to try and find out a bit more about this Christian name and where it had come from. She knew it was a family name, and it was a name given to the eldest female daughter, was the story.
Right, okay.
So it was like, this is a really unusual name. Where did it come from? I think I've got an idea where it might have come from, but it did take a bit of unpicking. And like a lot of family stories, there's some elements of truth and lots of fiction. And as a little girl, my mother was full of stories, and I can remember, I was only 13 when my grandmother died, but I can remember as a small child meeting some of these elderly aunts, or they seemed very elderly aunts to a 3-4-year-old, and they were quite intimidating working class ladies who'd had a hard life in the cotton mills of Lancashire.
Yeah.
And my mother used to tell stories, and some of the things that I've researched, there's a bit of truth lurking in there, and again, some elements of fiction.
There's no smoke without fire.
Absolutely.
So how did you progress with researching those? Did you have a whole load of documents and photographs? And you've mentioned that there are a few living relatives. Were they kind of receptive to being asked about the family history?
Sadly, it's one of these things that remained in my mind. And my mother actually died a few years before her 52nd birthday. Oh. And so my grandmother had passed away by that time as well. So those immediate sources of the family archive, the oral tradition of the family archive were long gone. But Fortunately, I've got a reasonable memory, and my sister will testify that she calls me elephant memory for some of the things that I can remember. I do not want that name bandying around the internet. Thank you, everybody. But
we'll edit that bit out.
Jolly good. And so I have some living cousins, and they knew a few little bits of the history because my mother had a brother. He and his wife had 3 children. So, we got some of those things. Okay. But I didn't really start doing things, as I say, until after I'd had my eldest daughter. And my mother-in-law always loved to be able to look after the child, a young granddaughter. And in those days, I lived in Cambridgeshire, and my husband worked in London. So I would go to London with him for the day. And whilst he went to work, I would go to St. Catherine's House.
Nice.
And I built up my muscles on the registers in St. Catherine's House.
Hefty books, yeah.
Heaving them off and working. Anybody that's done that has got their muscles.
It's like a gym workout.
Absolutely. I started with those very basics of identifying the certificates, the vital events, and slowly, because of course I wasn't working then, so we didn't have a lot of cash to spare, but slowly and steadily accumulating the certificates. And as family members passed on, occasionally people would say, "Oh, I've got this certificate, would you like it?" type of thing. Basically, I would dabble. I would read books, read articles. I was primarily self-taught in those early days.
Yep.
And I didn't really do much. I thought if I got people back to 1837, then at least I'd got the basics, the foundation stones of being able to do something in the fullness of time.
Okay.
But in actual fact, because of my mother-in-law's curiosity, my husband occasionally had to come and work in Scotland. So I'd come with him and I'd have a few days trotting along to Scotland's people. And I researched my mother-in-law's family tree in Scotland's people. So when I really got going later, I knew far more about the basics and slightly less basics of Scottish research.
Yep.
She'd always told me that her father was a Scot. He came from Aberdeenshire, and in actual fact, he was born in Aberdeenshire, but his father came from Dumfriesshire. And when the children were very small, we quite often went on holiday. One year, we went on holiday to Cumbria, and my husband had organised various days out, and so we piled into the car one day, and he was very mysterious about where we were going. And he just kept saying to me, "You'll see." So, of course, we'd got his mum and his dad in the car with us. And as we trundled further up the M6 and we crossed the border, I just went, "I think I know where we're going." So we did indeed end up in the village of Langham in Dumfriesshire. And, of course, when we get out of the car, it's like, well, where do we go now? Because all the churches were far too modern to be something that I was looking for.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I've no idea where the graveyards are because we were on a graveyard hunt, obviously. And so I went to the tourist information and I asked the lady there and I said, "Can you tell me where the graveyard is?" And she said, "Who are you looking for?" Reached under the counter and pulled out this list because people had recorded the MIs of the three cemeteries.
Fantastic.
So as soon as I gave her the names, she went, "That's the graveyard you need to go to. You need to turn up there, go up there," and what have you. She said, "We haven't got a plan. I can't tell you exactly where it is, but that's where the grave is." And in actual fact, we found the graves which actually had headstones on.
Nice.
And those headstones were perfect for confirming that the research that I had done so far was accurate. And it also identified the death of a child which had occurred in Upper Canada. Oh. And then we spotted another gravestone very close by where we were able to record what was inscribed and get that information. Now move on a little bit to when my eldest daughter by this time has started at university here in Edinburgh. And we're still in the days of dial-up connections.
The magical days.
And she said, "Oh, I've seen somebody looking online for this family in Langham." And she said, "I'm wondering if it's a relative." And the gentleman in question, who sadly has now passed away, his email address was UK for Cambridge University. And so we dialed up and I sent him an email. And I knew immediately whether it would be the right person because the surname's not that unusual. Because I gave him the first name, which was my mother-in-law's Christian name. And I thought, if he's got this lady in his family tree, it's the right person. And he replied less than 24 hours later and said, yes, he was indeed the child. This lady who was born in London, sadly, before civil registration started in England, married a chap from Scotland, and she had 6 children, and there were 3 boys, and the gentleman I was emailing was descended from the eldest child, and my husband was from the younger surviving boy. And he messaged me and he said, a few years ago, I went to the tourist information office in Langham asking where the graveyard was. And so the lady got the list out and asked me the names. And she said, we had a lady in here a few weeks ago asking about the same names. And it took us something like 10 years before we actually made that connection.
Wow, that is a coincidence, but just slightly out of sequence.
Just slightly. So then, as I say, I used to make occasional trips down to London and record things and gather what information I could, slowly starting to build a family tree.
Okay.
Move on a considerable generation, and by this time my eldest daughter is about to become her mother herself. And she decides during her maternity leave she's going to get an account with this newfangled thing called Ancestry that she's heard about. And she starts using Ancestry, and so she sort of found the information, and I was able to give her the information I had.
Yeah.
And, I would look, and occasionally I might think, that doesn't look quite right. I'll go in and do a bit of research myself. We correct it and what have you. And then when I was approaching retirement, I started doing more and more online research, revisiting what I'd done previously, editing, correcting, because we all make mistakes as we're going along. And
yeah, absolutely.
But I've been able to create quite a broad family tree.
Yep.
And during lockdown, and I'll tell you more about it later, I spent a long time building a new branch of the family tree, which was based on my mother's grandmother. And there's some interesting stories in there.
You are clearly someone who enjoys researching. You are clearly someone who enjoys learning and studying and earning qualifications. So were your qualifications something that you did to kind of help your research, or did you feel that they were kind of needed in order to be a professional genealogist?
I think it was a bit of all sorts, really. I didn't go to university when I was younger, but in the work that I'd done, because I spent almost 30 years working in various roles in citizen advice, which meant researching the advice, researching the information, recording the information, interpreting what you've found for the person who's sitting before you. And that has to be done in a very objective way, in that clients would say, well, what would you do? And of course, it's not what you would do. All you're doing is giving them the options that are available. Yeah. It's got to be their decision at the end of the day. So that teaches the importance of the objectivity in assessing the evidence in front of you. And so, yes, very transferable skills. Yeah. And during my working life, I'd had the opportunity to do some NVQs, very committed to this lifelong learning. And as I approached retirement, my husband had been given early retirement from work, and he said he'd become the house husband. He was wonderful. And he said, well, what are you going to do when you retire? I don't want you getting in my way. And I said, we've put 3 daughters through higher education. It's mother's turn now, and I'm going to look at how I can get a professional qualification to do research properly, as I phrased it. And so I started off just by doing some taster courses that were online learning. Okay. Now, just before I retired, Citizens Advice were introducing what we called bite-sized learning, which was online learning and so forth. But I thought, if you're going to enroll to do a degree, it's a lot of money, and I wanted to be sure that it was right for me to be able to do it in an online way. And so I did the 2 6-week short courses, and they're not accredited or anything of this sort. And then I applied to do the degree. And because I'd done my NVQs at level 4 and level 5, I remembered we'd been told when we did them, they can qualify you for higher education and there will be an acceptable qualification. So I basically rang up and asked the question and said, are my NVQs worth anything as part of the application? And they said, yes, absolutely. I had to write one side of A4 about what skills I had and why I wanted to do that. Because I hadn't been to university, they said, well, we'll enroll you for the postgraduate certificate. Yeah. And then, depending on how you get on, we will then decide whether we will permit you to continue to do the diploma and the master's degree. And so Dundee gave me the opportunity to study. Because of technology, I was able to do that from the comfort of my own home, and also the agony of my own home, because at times you were looking at things and you would have the scenario of, does this mean this or does it mean that? Some ambiguity in questions and exercises, and you really didn't have anybody that you could be mulling it over with. You hadn't got the sort of the coffee bar experience where you could chat over it. What do you think about this? And because you're working on your own, you've got to be quite disciplined about doing it. You've really got to stick at it. And when the going gets tough, and it did from time to time, and you were banging your head on the desk, it was like, why am I doing this? But I got there in the end, and graduated in 2016. And of course, I'd written my master's dissertation based on what had happened in my then hometown. And it was like, well, why would Scotland be different? Because all the literature was saying, oh, nothing like this happened in Scotland. And I thought, well, why not? And so I spent the next year, just when I had the opportunity, having a little bit of a dig and a search online and things of this sort. And then I actually found something that said, yeah, well, actually, it did happen in Scotland, but nobody's written about it. Hence my PhD.
Do you think that you have, in all of the research that you've done, do you think that you have a favourite type of record?
Oh, undoubtedly, my favourite records are workhouse records. I love workhouse records.
I think most people seem to grimace a bit when they see that maybe one of their relatives is being sent to the workhouse, or they're in the workhouse on the census, and they kind of grimace. And are you in the camp of thinking that workhouses are a bad thing or a good thing?
I think workhouses are a mixed thing.
I'll allow that, yeah.
And when I've given talks about workhouses, I usually start the talk just in the sort of introductory bit, and then I say, right, hands up everybody who's got a birth certificate that's got the workhouse address on it.
Yep.
Or it says in the workhouse, and they all, more than half put their hands up. And I'll say, and who has got a death certificate and they died in the workhouse? And again, about half the hands come up.
Yeah.
And so I will then say, and do you know why? And I then go and just briefly explain about the medical role of the poor law unions and the infirmaries, and it being the only place where the poor could acquire medical attention.
Yeah.
That in a lot of cases, that was where women went to give birth. And in other cases, that's where, sadly, people went to die. And
Absolutely.
It's they put granddad in the workhouse scenario.
Yeah.
And it's, well, first of all, most people don't realise that the family would have possibly have gone through a financial assessment to see whether or not they had to make a contribution to the accommodation in the workhouse, particularly in families where everybody, even the youngest child who could, had to work to keep food on the table. And they just did not have the time, the skills, the personnel to help look after this elderly relative who probably was suffering from dementia. And the workhouse infirmary, sadly, was the only place that they would be able to be cared for.
Yeah.
And the care was not great, but it was a source of information.
It was there.
It was there. And the interesting thing is that, because in England and in Scotland, the sort of workhouse scenarios are different, and things happen earlier in England. But if you're thinking about the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which leads to our civil registration, which leads on, the whole idea originally was the establishment of the Board of Guardians would be to oversee what went on in that poor law union. They were the great and good who were elected to represent the various parishes which had previously provided poor relief. And they were the only uniform system of, shall I call it, civic administration in England and Wales. You had certain towns which had their mayors and their boroughs and what have you, but It was consistent. They were supposed to abide by the same set of rules. They had to report to the Poor Law Commission. Yes, I'm glad to hear you chuckling there. And, and this was, you had to build the workhouses and everybody had to come in for indoor relief, and it was going to be, and it was terrible and what have you. And that, I think Charles Dickens has a certain amount to answer for.
Yes, he does.
But also, as time evolves, because they have become this sort of established form of uniform civic administration, right, no matter how good or bad it actually was, the government would be introducing more legislation and more roles would be placed on the shoulders of the Board of Guardians. So you've got the medical stuff, you've got when they bring in the Education Act, for example. These are more and more and more roles. And the problem is that it's even like a school board or something, even these days, that you need quite a lot of good skills to deliver a good service in that sort of those levels of responsibility. And sadly, too many boards of guardians did not have directors sitting there who were capable. The guardians simply did not have the necessary skills to manage. And this was why things would start to go wrong. And they were not necessarily strong enough as individuals to stand up to perhaps a workhouse master who was being bullied and all the horrible things that we hear about, because they didn't know how to deal with all those personnel issues. They didn't have an HR department to help them or anything of this sort. So if the records survive, and that's patchy, and whenever I see a question on Facebook Workhouse Network or anything and said, I'm interested in Braintree Workhouse, for example, and I say, right, Peter Higginbotham's website, that has got to be the first port of call for anything workhouse related.
Absolutely.
You can learn so much there on his website.
It's a complete trove of information. I've spent a lot of hours reading that site, and
you should be able to find what records survive and where you ought to be able to find them.
100%. We'll put a link in the show notes for that. Now, final question, Sylvia. What one thing do you wish you'd known before you started researching?
Write it all down properly.
Very wise. The lives of our ancestors are full of twists and turns, and sometimes they do the right thing, and sometimes they do the wrong thing. With that in mind, I shall now ask my guest to pick one of their most fascinating relatives and share their life story. Okay, Sylvia, who are you going to introduce us to?
Well, I'm actually going to start initially by, I looked at my maternal great-grandmother, who I remember being told as a child she had twins. This was a great story in the family. Beware for the women, beware if you become pregnant, because your great-grandmother had twins. And so during lockdown, researching that family and in much more detail became my sort of lockdown fix of family history. And indeed, my great-grandmother, who was called Naomi, was indeed one of twins.
Okay.
And she was born in 1845. And she had a twin sister, Ruth, who sadly died very young, within a month or so of birth. Then Naomi's mother, who was called Sarah, gave birth to another child in 1849. And sadly, both Sarah and Sarah's, her daughter was called Sarah, and Sarah and her daughter both died. And so Naomi, who at this point is about 3.5, 4 years old, her mother has died.
Oh, dear.
But in actual fact, as I started to dig into the tree a little bit more, not only did I discover that Naomi was indeed a twin, but in actual fact, she had a much older sister who was also a twin, and whose twin sister had also died shortly after birth. So my poor old great-grandmother, Sarah, in actual fact, gave birth, I think it's 13 times, I think. And other than the 2 twin girls who failed to survive, all the rest of them grew to adulthood.
So still quite a large family.
The surname is Hawarth. Now, They come from Lancashire, and in Haworth can be spelt in a variety of ways, and it does. So it can come up as Haywarth, Howarth, and anything in between.
The one that I've written down whilst you've been talking is Howarth.
Some of them do appear as HOW, but strictly they're HAW, and they have been consistent in going back because, of course, Naomi's parents were George and Sarah, and George's parents, it was the Haywarth version all the time, but it does get corrupted.
Yeah.
And as I took this wider tree, it enabled me to follow some of the fascinating stories, not only of Naomi Hawarth, but also her children, who, when I spoke about the formidable aunts when I was a tiny child, two of them were, I say, cotton workers in Lancashire, and they are actually emigrated to Canada. So some of these intimidating ladies came to visit us when we were children, and I can remember at that point always wanted to go to Canada, and I did eventually. But they were, I think they probably went in that era when a lot of textile workers emigrated to North America to take their skills as weavers to help develop the industries.
Okay.
And when I followed that branch down, I discovered that I've got a cousin who lives in Hawaii, and I'm very disappointed. She's never invited me for a visit, but there you go, you can't have everything.
Oh, well, fingers crossed.
But when I looked along at Naomi's older siblings, there was a couple of interesting things. One of which was there was an Emmanuel Hawarth, which is spelt as EMAN or EMMAN or IM. So again, you've got to be prepared for these variations in the spellings. Anyway, Emmanuel had several children, and some of them ended up working. One lady, descendant in the early 1920s, was working as a child chaperone in Hollywood.
Oh, wow.
So when you see the likes of Shirley Temple and things of this sort, you've got those associations there.
Yeah.
And it also, this extended family tree that I worked on in sort of 2020, eventually became something that helped me and other people sort out the mysterious NPE DNA connections.
Ah, okay.
We know exactly which little line that came from. So that was Emmanuel. Now, there was a wonderful story that would go in the family as well about, I don't think they called him Mad Uncle Martin, but he was certainly an eccentric, was Martin. And
okay.
But when I researched his particular branch, he married a lady called Mirinda, and he and Mirinda had several children, and then Mirinda died unexpectedly. And I think that he then remarried, and on that remarriage, that relationship broke down. And I think at that point, he went to pieces. He'd been a fairly successful cotton mill manager, and he ends up being up before the magistrate for poaching and assaulting the local gamekeeper.
Oh dear.
Yes, he finally ended up living in a caravan on the Fylde coast just outside Blackpool. Again, a little bit of DNA connection here a while ago, and it was a newspaper account that suddenly triggered it for me. And I came across one of his descendants was a chap called James. Now, can you imagine how many James Haworths were born in the 1870s in that part of Lancashire? Let's say it's not quite John Smith, but it's getting there. There are several.
Oh, I hate it when that happens.
We've always had this thing in the family that we were quite a musical family. And anyway, when I was satisfied I got the right James Haworth and found him on census records and things, he started off in his working life as becoming a pupil teacher. And we have quite a lot of teachers in the family as well. And as I follow him, suddenly he's no longer a pupil teacher. He's decided to abandon teaching, and he's now working as a musician. And he ends up during the First World War, He has one of these troops. They're called the Little Gems, and if you search in the stage newspaper records on B&A or whatever for the Little Gems, you'll see that they gave concert parties for the wounded soldiers who were in the nursing homes along the south coast.
Very nice.
He eventually became the musical director and was obviously conducting at one of these theatres on the pier type of scenario. And sadly, he had a stroke one evening in the middle of the concert and left his wife widowed. And they had one daughter, and his wife and his daughter can both be found appearing on the West End stage at one point. And the daughter herself went on to have a son, and I've got a DNA match with the son, and we were eventually able to work out. But it was only when James, the musical director, got married, and there's a newspaper account, and it says, son of Martin Hawarth of Fylde in Lancashire. And Martin is quite an unusual first name in Lancashire. And so it was like, that's the one. So there are some nice little successful stories. And I eventually got a photograph of James Hawarth's daughter, which I immediately shared with my cousins and my siblings. And she's a dead ringer for my mother. Absolute dead ringer for my mother.
Wow. I love it when genetic traits kind of echo through the generations and the more distant relatives, and they kind of echo into the photographs, and you look at them going, is that? No. And it isn't them.
So I think one of the unhappier stories that come from some of the siblings of Naomi is her brother married, and sadly, he died quite young, leaving a widow with a few children. And eventually, the boy goes off the rails. No two ways about it. He does enlist in the army for a while, and he seems to do quite well, and he's welcomed back as a hero, at the time of the Boer War and things of this sort. But then he's poaching.
Oh, no. There's an echoing trait you don't need.
And then he's getting a little bit poaching with a little bit too handy with his fists or with the cosh.
Oh, no.
And then he starts breaking and entering, and he seems to spend many years in and out of various prisons. He spends some time in Wakefield jail, and then eventually he ends up in Dartmoor because he's breaking and entering, and he has severely injured a householder who caught him in the act. So as a result, he gets sent down. He's in Dartmoor, and his health is not the greatest. I suspect he may have had a cancerous tumour on his spine, because eventually he's not able to walk, and he needs some hospital treatment, and so they can't treat him in the prison, so he's sent to the local hospital.
Right.
And whilst he's in the hospital, sadly, he commits suicide. So, of course, there's an inquest report. I could not find this chap by name only. I knew when he died because I got a hunch told me to get the death certificate, and it gave me the confirmed details of the inquest. So that really limited when I needed to be able to search.
Okay.
And so by doing that, I actually searched, by using the word inquest, I was actually able to find it. And it's a very graphic detail of what actually happened.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, that's a really sad ending for him.
These days, he would probably have been on suicide watch because he obviously couldn't cope with life in prison because of his physical disabilities. And he just saw no end to his life. His life ended very, very sadly. I've no idea where he's buried. He's probably in the grave at Dartmoor because his sister had herself not long given birth, had a fairly large family, and I think she would probably very unlikely have been able to transport his body back from Devon up to Lancashire for a local burial. One day I'll try and find out where he's buried. So we've had some, I've had some fun chasing my great-grandmother's siblings. It passed the time wonderfully during lockdown, and I was able to set up a little family group with my sisters and my cousins, and I was able to send them stories. And I also haunted Facebook.
Did you?
Don't we all when we're looking for somebody?
I couldn't possibly comment.
And I found a descendant of the eldest twin. I found some of her descendants. And I sort of knew vaguely from my mother that she was related to a head teacher, distant cousin sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I was actually able to prove that was right. But the descendant of that elder twin that survived was able to send me some photographs.
Oh, exciting.
And she was identifying various people in the photographs.
Nice. Definitely haunt Facebook for this reason.
So I have a picture of the eldest surviving twin.
Nice.
And my great-grandmother.
Okay.
So I then played and I put them next to each other. And they are so alike. If you didn't know that there was 15 years between them, when they are adult women, they look incredibly alike.
Yeah. They look almost like twins to each other.
They do almost. If you didn't know, you would say, oh, they're twins.
Yeah.
They are twins, but they're not each other's twin.
So with all of the interesting, colourful lives that you have found from Naomi's siblings, how does Naomi's life compare?
Naomi had, I suppose, what we would call, in many terms, quite a mundane sort of life.
Okay.
As a small child, she was actually taken in by her grandmother. Now, when we were young, we used to go to a place called Townley Hall outside Burnley in Lancashire. And as you would tour the house and what have you, and they've got a great kitchen set-up thing. And my mother used to say, this is where Betty worked as a cook. Betty was Naomi's grandmother.
Right, okay.
Okay. What I was able to prove that Betty never worked as a cook in Townley Hall. But her older brother was the gamekeeper on the estate for Townley Hall. And when she became widowed, she went to live with him as his housekeeper. And that's where Naomi went to live as a small child. And when you actually look at the estate plan, the cottage that he occupied was literally sort of 200 yards from the big house. So there's that element of truth there, but there are inaccuracies there. Anyway, Naomi married a chap called James, and my own grandmother was the youngest in that particular family, and it was her two older sisters who went off to Canada. And as I say, they were ordinary working class textile mill workers in Lancashire.
Okay.
And so for many people, that's considered to be pretty much working class. The records are difficult, but there are records there if you persevere, and that's what you've got to do. I didn't just use the BMDs, I was using the census, I was using newspapers, I was using, looking at emigration records, and eventually being able to make various connections with people. The other interesting point from pre-civil registration, because the eldest twins were born pre-civil registration.
Oh, so rude.
Most inconsiderately, they were born in 1836, the eldest twins, so inconsiderate. And their father was a very big noise in the local Baptist church. Now, Baptists use adult baptism, they don't baptize children. But actually, of the chapel where he was very heavily involved, they had a list of records of all the children that had been born to parents within the congregation. And that's how I know that Mary, the surviving twin, had a sister. And we do follow biblical names very strongly within this family. And Mary's surviving twin sister, who sadly died, was Martha.
Mary's sister, yeah.
And so Mary and Martha are the older pair of twins. Naomi and Ruth are the younger pair of twins. And my cousin's called Ruth Naomi. So the family names have continued.
If the family names have continued and you've got some sisters who are born so far apart but look like twins, there's obviously something that's being passed along there quite nicely as like a good set of coincidences. So in Naomi's line, in your line, are there many teachers or musical people or Baptist ministers or even poachers?
I'm not aware of any poachers, so, perhaps they've managed to not get caught.
That's okay. That's probably a good thing, yes.
But my grandmother, my mother's mother, was a textile worker. And my mother was, in fact, a teacher.
Okay.
My sister's a teacher.
Yeah.
Or she was till she retired. And I think when I look at what my cousins do, my three cousins were the first descendants of Naomi that went to university. So, we're seeing that importance that the working class attached to education. My mother was very lucky. She passed what was called her scholarship. By the time she passed her scholarship, her parents were able to afford for her to go to the grammar school. But when her older brother was, passed his scholarship, they couldn't afford to send him. And it's his children that were actually the first in the family to go to university. So my uncle very much valued the importance of education.
Sure.
Getting Sunday school education, the family were nonconformist, but they were all going to Sunday school, involved in the that was the only place where education could be achieved before elementary education. And education was definitely seen to be a way out of poverty. And that little bit of, not hugely, but that little bit of social exclusion.
Sure, that makes sense. I mean, knowledge is power, and I think that still works now to help lift people out of poverty. So what about the musical side? Has that trait carried on through the family as well?
Of course, I don't now, but I mean, when I was a lot younger, I used to sing and I did musical exams for singing. My sister still sings in a choir. She plays the piano. And my brother's niece, she is very, very musical, as is her sister. And she's got music from her parents. And my own grandson plays a pretty mean guitar, I have to say. And not to my taste, but he can do it. So the musical gene is coming through.
Excellent. Well, it certainly sounds like even though Naomi was the twin of Ruth and Mary was the twin of Martha, those sisters were sort of twins in a sort of way, but also their siblings and their siblings' descendants have all carried some familiar traits through history. So thank you, Sylvia, for telling us the life story of Naomi Hawarth and that of some of her siblings. But I think it's time for you to face the brick wall. If you're not hitting a brick wall from time to time, then are you really doing family history research? They are undoubtedly annoying, lasting for what feels like forever. And sometimes it just takes a different set of eyes or a new idea to make a breakthrough. It's therefore now time for my guest to share one of their brick walls in a hope that one of you, dear listeners, can help solve it. So, Sylvia, what have you got for us?
Well, this is a brick wall that's in my late husband's branch of the family tree.
Okay.
My husband's grandmother, her maiden name was Crow, as in the bird, not Russell.
Okay.
So when we go up that little branch of crows, we eventually get to a marriage quite early on to Edward Crow. And he married a lady. Now, I may get the pronunciation of the surname incorrect, so bear with me. I will spell it. And he married a lady called Mary Ann, and I think her surname is pronounced something like Fegan. Now, it's spelt reasonably consistently as F-I-E-G-E-H-E-N.
Okay.
And if I'm pronouncing it wrong, I apologise to all and sundry. Now, she had a father who was called, slightly variously, Bernard, Brand.
Fegan. Okay.
And there was also a George that popped up in the middle of it from time to time. But the one thing that's consistent is City Road in London. Now, I'm going to call him Bernard for the sakes of simplicity. Bernard, he died in 1830, very inconsiderate, no census information, and he's buried in the Bunhills Fields Nonconformist Cemetery in London.
Right, okay.
And his occupation, and he appears in trade directories and things of this sort, was what was called a Chinaman. Chinaware, glassware, ceramic wares, that type of thing. Now, it's a fairly unusual name, and at first I thought, well, might it be Irish? Thinking vegan, that type of thing.
Okay.
But, and this is where the big but, I can find nothing about him. I've found his marriage to a lady called Mary Wilkinson. I found some children. And when I look, of course, the marriage takes place before we have things like father's information and anything of that sort.
That's annoying.
It's just not there. Now, there are some trees on a famous, well-known website, famous for its shaky green leaves. One or two trees suggest that his father came from Berlin or that part of Germany. Now, I find that when I search and look to see what evidence these trees might have, it always seems to be copied from another tree. Nobody seems to be able to find me any evidence. As I say, I've got nothing that indicates why there might be a German connection. I have no idea if there's any truth in that at all. And whilst one lives in hopes that someday somebody's got a miraculous set of records that will answer all my questions, I'm afraid that was as far as I got up that particular branch of the family tree.
Well, that's fair enough. It sounds like you've certainly tried.
I welcome any clues that people might have. I mean, Bernard left a will. His first wife died quite young. He married again. She's left a will. So, we've got some information, but there's not really anything that tells me who Bernard was and why he suddenly appeared as what appears to be quite a prosperous trader working on the City Road in London.
Wow. Well, that is a brick wall. That is tantalising. So we're talking Bernard Brandfegen?
Yes, and I believe that he's born approximately 1755.
Okay.
Dies 1830. But as we say sometimes, who's the daddy? And the mummy as well, obviously.
Wow. So he was on City Road in London, occupation as a Chinaman, which is, pottery, glassware.
You can see him on rate books and trade directories and, those sort of early things. But I'm stuck.
It would be lovely to find that connection, whether it is Berlin in Germany or not. So what's the best way for people to contact you if they think that they have a clue or a research idea?
Well, I have an email address on Register of Qualified Genealogists, which is Sylvia Valentine, all one word, at qualified genealogists, all one word, .org.
Perfect. And of course, listeners can head over to familyhistoriespodcast.com where they can read this episode's show notes or send us a message, or they can email us at hello@familyhistoriespodcast.com and we'll pass it right along to Sylvia. My fingers are crossed. And as our listeners pop those brick wall busting hard hats on, it's just possible that I might be able to help you with this. But you'll need to follow me through to the garage.
Intrigued. Good grief, what's all this stuff?
This, Sylvia, is my secret time machine.
You're having a laugh.
No, this is a fully functional, scientifically calibrated time machine. It's got all the physics.
I thought you meant you've got a box of useful documents. I'm not really convinced by this time machine.
Well, if it's not a time machine, then if you take a seat over there and I set the temporal coordinates to a date and place of your choice and nothing happens, then all you've lost was just a few moments. Or you could take a seat over there while I set the temporal coordinates and be zapped back in time so that you can try to solve your brick wall for yourself. I think that's worth a gamble.
Will I need vaccinating first?
Oh, good question. Hold on. Well, I've got some hand sanitizer and half an aspirin.
I guess that'll have to do.
You'll also need this, and to keep it with you at all times.
What's this?
That's a temporal beacon. It's your ticket back here. When you're ready to come home, just press the button on the top.
This one?
That's it. Now, all you need to tell me, Sylvia, is the date and place you'd like to go back in time to.
I think I'd like to visit Bernard's shop on City Road, round about 1820.
Nice. You couldn't get me a replacement gravy boat, could you? Oh, actually, no, forget that. Let me just adjust the Tesseract, City Road, London. And June the 3rd looks good. Okay, there we go. All set. Okay, here we go. Sylvia Valentine. Thank you, goodbye, and good luck. Well, she did say she wanted to see China. Just maybe not Shanghai. The Family Histories podcast was presented and produced by me, Andrew Martin. My guest was the brilliant Sylvia Valentine, and if you've enjoyed this episode, then why not share it with your friends on your favourite social media channel? Thank you for listening. Approximately no family historians were harmed in the making of this podcast.